April 29, 1943. First Lieutenant Louis Edward Curdes was doing math in his head. At 10,000 feet over the shimmering, sun-baked Strait of Sicily, the 23-year-old kid from Fort Wayne, Indiana, wasn't thinking about patriotism, glory, or the romantic myths of being a fighter pilot. To Curdes, aerial combat was just a brutal, high-speed calculus equation. You measure your airspeed, you calculate your angle of attack, and you violently dismantle the enemy machine before the other guy can solve the geometry of your flight path. He was staring down at the death throes of the North African campaign. Erwin Rommel's legendary Africa Corps was backed against the sea, starving for fuel and ammunition. The German Luftwaffe was running desperate, massive aerial convoys across the Mediterranean to keep them alive. Curdes's job, flying with the 95th Fighter Squadron of the 82nd Fighter Group, was to sever that supply line. To execute this mathematical slaughter, the United States Army Air Forces didn't give him a nimble little dogfighter. They gave him a 15,000-pound twin-engine broadsword, the Lockheed P-38G Lightning. The P-38 was a completely alien concept to the European theater, while the German Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the British Spitfire were tiny, single-engine scalpels designed to twist and turn in tight horizontal circles. The Lightning was built for pure, crushing momentum. Powered by two 1,000-horsepower Allison V1710 engines, its massive size hid its absolute deadliest feature. Because the engines were mounted out on the twin booms, the entire nose cone of the aircraft was hollowed out and packed with 4.5 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon. Because these guns were clustered dead center, they didn't have a converging spray pattern like the wing-mounted guns of a Mustang or a Wildcat. Wherever Louis Curdes pointed the nose of his P-38, a laser-straight buzzsaw of armor-piercing incendiary rounds followed. It was a flying firing squad. Before we follow Lieutenant Curdes into the meat grinder of the Mediterranean, where he will begin an absolutely unprecedented kill streak that will ultimately force him to shoot down an American plane, if you believe the true unfiltered mechanics of the Second World War deserve to be preserved, please hit that like button. It tells the algorithm that the WWII frontliner community values real tactical history over Hollywood exaggerations. Subscribe so you don't miss the rest of this incredible saga. And we want to hear from you. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from and whether anyone in your family served in it. We read every single comment to keep these legacies alive. Now, let's jump into the desperate skies over the Mediterranean. On that late April morning, the radar controllers vectored the 82nd Fighter Group to intercept a massive formation of German Junkers U-52 transport planes attempting to reach Tunisia. But the transports were not flying alone. Flying top cover above the lumbering cargo planes was a swarm of lethal Messerschmitt Bf-109G fighters. The Bf-109 Gustav was the backbone of the Luftwaffe. It was fast, possessed a terrifying climb rate, and in a horizontal turning fight, it would effortlessly outmaneuver the massive American P-38. Curdes understood the physics of his machine. He knew that engaging the Messerschmitts in a turning dogfight was suicide. He had to use the Lightning's massive weight and unparalleled dive speed to dictate the terms of the engagement. Spotting the German fighters below him, Curdes shoved the twin throttles to the firewall and pushed the heavy control yoke forward. The massive P-38 dropped out of the sky like a streamlined anvil. The airspeed indicator whipped past 400 miles per hour. Curdes picked out a Bf-109 attempting to break formation. The German pilot, realizing a massive twin-engine fighter was plummeting toward him, hauled back on his stick to pull into a tight, evasive turn. But Curdes didn't need to follow him through the turn. He only needed the Messerschmitt to cross the path of his centralized nose guns for a fraction of a second. Calculating the deflection angle by pure instinct, Curdes clamped down on the trigger. The concentrated wall of .50 caliber and 20mm fire intercepted the turning Bf-109 perfectly. The heavy rounds smashed through the Messerschmitt's thin aluminum skin, instantly severing the coolant lines of its Daimler-Benz engine and shattering the cockpit. The German fighter snapped violently to the right, trailing a massive plume of white glycol smoke, and began a terminal plunge into the Mediterranean. One kill. Curdes immediately hauled back on the yoke, trading his massive dive speed for a staggering vertical climb, leaving the remaining slower-climbing Bf-109 struggling in his wake. He crested the top of his arc, rolled the heavy Lightning inverted, and plunged back into the fray. By the time the brutal, chaotic engagement over the Cap Bon Peninsula ended, Louis Curdes had executed this exact mechanical geometry 3 separate times. He shot down 3 Bf-109s and heavily damaged a 4th in a single morning. In less than an hour, the kid from Indiana had proven he was a master of energy tactics. A month later, he shot down 2 more Bf-109s, officially making him an ace. But the Axis powers were not just flying German aircraft. On June 24, 1943, flying a sweep over the Mediterranean, Curdes encountered a completely different aerodynamic threat, the Italian Mach-E C-202 Fulgore. The Mach-E was widely considered one of the most beautiful and deadly fighters of the war. It paired a sleek, hyper-aerodynamic Italian airframe with a license-built German Daimler-Benz engine. It was faster than early Spitfires and could outturn almost anything in the sky. To fight a Mach-E in a P-38 was an incredibly dangerous proposition. Curdes didn't flinch. When his element engaged the Italian fighters, he once again relied on the raw, crushing speed of the Lockheed Lightning. He caught a Mach-E C-202 attempting to extend away from the fight. Pushing his Allison engines to their thermal limits, Curdes closed the gap, placing the Italian fighter dead in his reflector gun sight. A single, devastating burst from the P-38's centralized armament sawed through the Mach-E's sleek fuselage. The Italian fighter crumpled and fell from the sky. Curdes had now shot down German Messerschmitts and an Italian Mach-E. He was a highly decorated ace, universally respected by his squadron, and seemingly untouchable. But aerial combat is a merciless accountant, and eventually the physics catch up to everyone. On August 27, 1943, while flying a low-level strafing mission over Salerno, Italy, Curdes's luck violently ran out. He engaged an aggressive swarm of German Bf-109s. During a brutal, low-altitude turning fight where the P-38 was at its absolute weakest, a German pilot perfectly calculated a deflection shot. A burst of 20mm cannon fire smashed into Curdes's Lightning, crippling the aircraft. With his heavy fighter burning and losing altitude, Curdes had no choice. He popped the canopy and bailed out over enemy territory. He floated down into the Italian countryside, watching his beloved P-38 slam into the earth. The top-scoring ace was quickly captured by Italian soldiers. His war, it seemed, was over. He was destined to rot in a prisoner-of-war camp while the rest of the world fought on. But Louis Curdes was not a man who accepted defeat. His war was only half over, and the most bizarre, impossible chapter of his mechanical saga was about to begin on the complete opposite side of the planet. For a fighter pilot accustomed to dominating the three-dimensional geometry of the sky at 400 miles per hour, the sudden, grinding stasis of a prisoner-of-war camp is psychological torture. When First Lieutenant Louis E. Curdes bailed out of his burning Lockheed P-38 Lightning over Salerno, Italy in August 1943, he was immediately captured by Italian forces. Stripped of his flight gear and locked behind barbed wire in a POW camp near Rome, Curdes was forced to trade the cold mathematics of aerial combat for the brutal, agonizing arithmetic of sheer survival. But Curdes was not built for captivity. He was a tactician, and he knew that in war, the environment eventually provides an opening if you are disciplined enough to wait for it. That opening arrived on September 8, 1943. The Italian government, exhausted and beaten, officially signed an armistice with the Allies. Total chaos erupted. Before the German Wehrmacht could move in to secure the camps and transfer the prisoners to the brutal stalags of the Third Reich, the Italian guards simply dropped their rifles and walked away. Curdes didn't hesitate. He slipped out of the camp and vanished into the rugged, unforgiving terrain of the Apennine Mountains. For the next 8 months, the top-scoring ace lived like a ghost. He traded his flight suit for civilian rags, evaded ruthless German patrols, survived the freezing Italian winter, and meticulously navigated his way south. In May 1944, he finally crossed over into British lines. He was safe. He was sent back to the United States. He had earned the right to sit out the rest of the war behind a mahogany desk. But aerial combat is an addiction, and Curdes demanded to return to the cockpit. He slammed face first into a rigid military bureaucracy. The United States Air Forces had an ironclad rule. Any pilot who had been shot down and successfully evaded capture with the help of local resistance networks could never fly combat missions in that same theater again. If Curdes went back to Europe, was shot down again, and broke under Gestapo interrogation, he could compromise the very underground networks that had kept him alive. The European theater was closed to him forever. So Curdes requested a transfer to a theater where the sky was bigger, the water was deeper, and the enemy was entirely different. By late 1944, he found himself assigned to the 4th Fighter Squadron of the elite 3rd Air Commando Group, operating out of the dusty, coral-crushed airstrips of the Philippines. The brass didn't give him another heavy twin-engine P-38. They gave him the ultimate iteration of American fighter design, the North American P-51D Mustang. Curdes named his new aircraft Bad Angel. The D model of the Mustang was a fundamentally different beast than the early Razorback versions. North American aviation engineers had completely redesigned the rear fuselage, cutting it down to install a massive, teardrop-shaped plexiglass bubble canopy. This single modification revolutionized the geometry of a dogfight. Pilots like Don Gentile in the early P-51Bs had been plagued by a massive blind spot behind their heads. Curdes, sitting under the bubble canopy, possessed 360-degree uninterrupted situational awareness. Furthermore, the wing armament had been upgraded from 4 to 6 50-caliber Browning M2 machine guns, heavily increasing the sheer volume of kinetic energy the fighter could throw into a turning enemy. Curdes adapted to the Mustang with the cold, mechanical precision that defined his career. He spent weeks mastering the Packard Merlin engine and the laminar flow wings. The Pacific Air War required an entirely different mindset. There were no massive bomber formations to escort over industrial cities. This was a war of vast, featureless oceans, sudden tropical squalls, and long-range hunter-killer sweeps. On February 7, 1945, Curdes was leading a flight of Mustangs on a deep penetration sweep just miles off the coast of Japanese-occupied Formosa, modern-day Taiwan. At 20,000 feet, the visibility was crystal clear. Curdes's eyes, trained to spot the microscopic silhouettes of German Messerschmitts over Africa, picked up a single bogey miles in the distance. It wasn't a nimble Mitsubishi Zero. It was a twin-engine Mitsubishi K-46, known to the Allies by the reporting name Dyna. To an interception pilot, the K-46 Dyna was a nightmare. It was a high-altitude strategic reconnaissance aircraft, and it was widely considered an aerodynamic masterpiece of the Japanese Imperial Army. It was stripped of heavy armor plating and defensive turrets, relying purely on its hyper-streamlined airframe and two 1,500-horsepower Mitsubishi H-112 radial engines to survive. The Dyna was essentially a flying teardrop. It could hit speeds of 375 miles per hour at high altitude, fast enough to simply outrun most Allied fighters before they could even calculate an intercept geometry. Standard procedure for a Dyna pilot upon spotting American fighters was to firewall the throttles, enter a shallow dive, and vanish. But the Japanese pilot made a fatal miscalculation. He didn't realize he had been spotted by a P-51D Mustang that was flying at a higher altitude, holding a massive bank account of potential energy. Curdes shoved his throttle past the detent into war emergency power, simultaneously pushing the control stick forward. Gravity grabbed the 9,000-pound Mustang, accelerating it well past 400 miles per hour. The heavy American fighter effortlessly overtook the Japanese reconnaissance plane. The K-46 pilot, suddenly realizing his speed was not going to save him, violently broke into a hard, defensive turn. It was a useless gesture. Curdes had spent his entire combat career calculating the math of a turning target. He smoothly matched the Dyna's turn, bringing the Piper reflector gun sight to bear, pulling the exact required lead on the sleek Japanese aircraft. He didn't fire a long, spraying burst. He squeezed the trigger with surgical discipline. The 6.50 caliber machine guns hammered out a dense, concentrated stream of armor-piercing incendiary rounds. The geometry was perfect. The heavy rounds walked cleanly across the Dyna's right wing and tore directly into the unarmored starboard engine. The Ha-112 radial engine violently detonated. The sleek aerodynamic teardrop was instantly transformed into a ball of tumbling, burning debris that plummeted toward the South China Sea. Curdes pulled his Mustang out of the dive, checking his 6 to ensure he wasn't being tracked by unseen escorts. The sky was clear. When he landed Bad Angel back in the Philippines, the ground crews painted a tiny Japanese flag on the side of his cockpit, right next to the 7 German swastikas and the single Italian fascis. Louis Curdes had achieved an impossibly rare mathematical anomaly. He was officially one of only 3 American pilots in the entire Second World War to shoot down aircraft from all 3 major Axis powers: Germany, Italy, and Japan. He was an apex predator who had mastered 3 different theaters of war, flying 2 completely different types of high-performance fighters. His legend was secure. He had nothing left to prove. But exactly 3 days later, the cold, unforgiving mechanics of war would force Louis Curdes into the most bizarre, morally agonizing dogfight in the history of military aviation. In the vast, featureless expanse of the Pacific Ocean, navigation was just as deadly as the Japanese Empire. A single degree of error on a compass heading, compounded over hundreds of miles of open water, could mean vanishing forever into the deep. On February 10, 1945, First Lieutenant Louis E. Curdes was flying his North American P-51D Mustang, Bad Angel, on a search and rescue sweep. A few hours earlier, his wingman had been shot down by anti-aircraft fire over Batan Island, a heavily fortified speck of jungle sitting in the Luzon Strait between the Philippines and Taiwan. The Japanese garrison on Batan was notoriously brutal. To be captured there was to disappear into the nightmare of a POW camp, or worse, face immediate execution. Curdes was circling the island, scanning the ocean swells for a life raft, when his sharp eyes caught a massive, lumbering silhouette dropping out of the clouds. It was a Douglas C-47 Skytrain.
The C-47 was the workhorse of the Allied logistical effort. It was a massive, twin-engine transport plane, completely unarmed, carrying a crew of 4 and 8 passengers, and it was descending directly toward the Japanese-held dirt airstrip on Batan Island. Curdes instantly realized the terrifying reality of the geometry below him. The C-47 was profoundly lost. The pilot, fighting a failing radio and running on the absolute fumes of his fuel tanks, had spotted the airstrip and believed it was friendly territory. The transport's landing gear was dropping down. They were minutes away from touching down directly into the hands of a heavily armed Japanese battalion. Standard fighter protocols dissolved. Curdes banked his heavy Mustang hard, diving toward the massive transport plane. He desperately keyed his radio, switching through every emergency frequency, screaming at the pilot to pull up. Nothing but static. The C-47's radios were completely dead. Curdes dropped his Mustang down to the deck, flying dangerously close to the lumbering transport. He executed a violent, high-speed pass directly across the nose of the C-47, banking hard to show his American star insignia. He dropped his own landing gear, the universal pilot signal for "Follow me." The C-47 pilot, exhausted and entirely focused on getting his dying aircraft onto the ground, ignored the Mustang. The transport continued its slow, agonizing descent toward the Japanese runway.
Curdes pulled his Mustang around and lined up behind the transport. He had to escalate. He pushed the trigger on his control stick, firing a short, terrifying burst of .50 caliber tracer fire directly across the nose of the C-47. It was a universal, undeniable warning. Still, the massive Douglas transport kept descending. The pilot was utterly committed. He was out of fuel, and the dirt strip was his only option. Louis Curdes was now faced with the most agonizing arithmetic of his entire combat career. If he let the C-47 land, the 12 Americans on board would be captured, tortured, and likely killed by the Japanese garrison. If he intervened, the only tool he had was a machine designed to annihilate other aircraft. He had to shoot down an American plane to save the lives of the Americans inside it. But a C-47 is not a nimble fighter. It is a 16,000-pound aluminum bus filled with highly volatile aviation fuel and fragile human bodies. If Curdes miscalculated his deflection angle by even a fraction of an inch, his armor-piercing incendiary rounds would tear through the fuselage, slaughtering the passengers, or detonate the wing tanks in a massive, unsurvivable fireball. He had to execute the most precise surgical gunnery of the Second World War. Curdes dropped Bad Angel directly onto the tail of the C-47. He ignored the broad, vulnerable fuselage and focused his Piper reflector gun sight entirely on the transport's right engine nacelle. He didn't want to destroy the wing. He just needed to kill the Pratt & Whitney R-1830 radial engine. He waited until the distance closed to just a few dozen yards, nullifying any bullet drop or spread. He tapped the trigger. A microscopic burst of .50 caliber fire snapped out of the Mustang's wings. The rounds bypassed the fuel tanks completely and chewed directly into the right engine block of the C-47. The massive radial engine instantly seized, trailing a thick ribbon of smoke. But to Curdes' absolute disbelief, the C-47 didn't turn away. The pilot, fighting the massive asymmetric drag of a dead engine, stubbornly maintained his glide path toward the Japanese runway. Curdes hauled his Mustang around to the left side of the transport. He had no choice. He lined up his gun sight on the remaining left engine. He tapped the trigger a second time. The left engine shattered and died. The C-47 was now a 16,000-pound glider, sitting just hundreds of feet above the ocean. Without engine power, the pilot could no longer reach the Japanese airstrip. He was forced to fight the heavy, uncooperative yoke, wrestling the massive transport into a controlled ditching in the rough swells of the Pacific. The C-47 slammed into the water, skipping violently before settling into the surf. Curdes pulled his Mustang into a tight, anxious orbit above the sinking transport. He watched the fuselage doors pop open. To his immense relief, self-inflating life rafts spilled out into the water. He counted the survivors scrambling into the rubber boats. All 12 crew members and passengers had made it out alive. He stayed on station, circling the rafts to deter any Japanese patrol boats from leaving the island, until his own fuel gauge dropped to the red line. Curdes finally turned Bad Angel south and returned to his base in the Philippines. The next morning, an American PBY Catalina flying boat arrived at Batan Island, landing in the ocean under the protective cover of P-51 Mustangs. They pulled all 12 freezing, exhausted survivors from the life rafts. When the rescued crew was brought back to base, Curdes walked onto the tarmac to meet the people he had shot down. Among the passengers was a flight nurse named Svetlana Valeria. In an impossible twist of fate that defied all mathematical probability, Curdes had actually taken Svetlana on a date the night before her doomed flight. By shooting her out of the sky, he had saved her life. They would marry shortly after the war ended. A few days later, the ground crews walked up to the side of Louis Curtis's P-51D Mustang with a can of paint. Right next to the 7 German swastikas, the single Italian fasces, and the single Japanese rising sun, they painted a United States American flag. Louis Curdes remains the only American pilot in history to shoot down aircraft from all 3 Axis powers and 1 from his own country. He wasn't a reckless hero, he was a master of the machine. He understood the physics of aerial combat so intimately that he used a weapon of absolute destruction to perform a surgical rescue.
When we look back at the Second World War, the history books often strip away the mechanical grit in favor of sanitized, cinematic myths. But the true air war was dictated by men who calculated their odds in freezing cockpits at 400 miles per hour. That is the unfiltered, mechanical reality we strive to bring you here at WWII Frontliners. If this breakdown of the most bizarre dogfight of the Pacific War changed how you look at tactical aviation, do us a favor and crush that like button. It tells the algorithm that real history matters more than Hollywood fiction. Hit subscribe and ring the bell so you're locked in for our next mission breakdown. And before you sign off, drop into the comments. Let me know what city or country you're watching from today, and if anyone in your own family tree served in this conflict. We comb through every single comment because keeping these specific, gritty legacies alive is exactly why this channel exists. Curdes trusted the math, and he never hesitated. Check your 6, and we'll see you in the next video.